Hello! In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about glitch.com and how to get started making your own web application using HTML and JavaScript. So glitch.com is a developer environment entirely in the browser and it's cloud-based, so you can share your code with other people and work on this real time for rapid prototyping of web applications. And there's a couple of important elements for glitch.com for you to understand how this works. If you're looking at this page on this exact project, uwrl-aframe-example from the URL, you might have an option to remix this project that you see here on the top right corner. You can also access it by going to the drop-down menu here and selecting Remix, which will allow you to edit your own version of this project, and if you create an account, you can keep that project for later on to access it again and edit it further. You also see the different files associated with the project here, and most importantly, you have the Show option up here at the top, which from you can either open a new tab to preview your project, your actual deployed website, or you can see it next to the code in the same window and see it update in real time. So glitch.com will take your edits and it will redeploy the website every time you make any edits to your actual files. To give you an example of that now, let me change the header file here to something else, maybe like hello world. And you'll see that it refreshes in real time. And you can share this website with anyone else. They can go to the URL for other testing. And it works just like you might with a developer environment on your own computer without all the setup you have to go through. And so with that said, let's talk a little bit about HTML and JavaScript. So what we're seeing right now is our index.html file. And HTML, or hypertext markup language, is the piece of web development that defines the actual content that you would find on a web page. So it gives the content and the structure, whereas you use your JavaScript and, as you see here, your style.css to define the styling and the functionality that it might come with. And so you can have a same HTML file and change this functionality or change the styling of it to have the web page be displayed in entirely different ways. And the layout for HTML, as you can see here, is this series of tags. So every HTML page has to have this HTML tag as the leading parent tag to start with, and everything else fits inside of that. And then you see your head here. So the head is where you would specify things like metadata, things like the title of the web page. So you can see up here in this other tab that this is the title being reflected for the tab, as well as linking other scripts to it, other style sheets, any other type of content or assets that you might want to include. This would go in the head file, or the head tag. And then we have the body tag. And the body tag is where the actual content of the web page goes. And so you can go to W3C, I highly recommend it, a great site to tell you more about HTML and JavaScript development, and see what different types of tags are out there. But using A-frame, we'll talk a little bit more about the specific tags. And for the time being, let's just kind of give an example. So you see we have this H1 tag here, which defines a header at the level 1. We could add something like an H2 to be another header, and add in some example like hi there. And you'll see that this header structure goes all the way down to H6 of varying formatting and size to define a web page. Or, most often if you're adding actual just text content, you'd use like a paragraph tag or just P. And you can add in something like this is some text and see that come up on the page as well. And all of this is defined, the styling of it, by your CSS file. We won't use CSS very much in A-frame, but if you were defining your own website, or creating your own 2D website, you would do quite a bit of CSS styling to modify that. And I encourage you to look into it if you're interested in more web development work. So now let's talk a little bit about JavaScript. And as the name implies, right, it's a scripting language, so you'd probably most relate it to like Python, but it's relatively simplistic and it's very loose typing, which can be beneficial for rapidly writing code and prototyping things, but it can also be pretty dangerous. As I mentioned before, you can have this unexpected behavior that happens really quickly because the language itself doesn't do this enforcement very strictly. It kind of assumes that whoever's writing it knows what's going on exactly. And it actually has no relation to Java, the other language. If you're interested in the history of that and the naming, you can look that up. It's its own whole interesting area of history. But so let's go over kind of some of the basics of JavaScript. The first thing you see here is a console.log, and this is probably the closest thing you have to like doing like a print statement in JavaScript. So we see console.log hi here, and if we go over to kind of the actual proper web page and we refresh it, we'll see we just have hi being printed in the console. You can access that by normally right-clicking on a page and hitting inspect and going to the console. Every browser is a little bit different here, but it's normally some kind of right-click and going to look at the console. And so now let's look at the types for JavaScript. So JavaScript has very few types, actually. Of the primitives, it has numbers, it has strings, it has booleans, it has a null value, and then it also has arrays and objects. So arrays, you can see, are formatted here by using brackets. And what's interesting about JavaScript arrays is that they can actually contain a variety of different types within them. The same array could have numbers, it can have strings, it could have other arrays contained in it. And so that's kind of one of the things you have to look out for. One of the dangers with JavaScript is that you have to know what's in the array. You can't kind of assume a specific type to it. You have to be knowledgeable about what, if you're passed an array, what you're expecting to have be passed to you in that array and what to find in it, so based on what operations you want to do for it. And then we have objects, which are defined by these curly braces. So you have the properties of the objects notated with colons, and then the actual value for each of those properties. So we just have two strings here. And so you can see arrays in JavaScript are indexed. They're zero indexed, but it's kind of as you expect. You just do the variable name followed by the brackets of the index you want to access in the array. And then with objects, it's this dot notation. So it's just the variable name and then dot whatever property it is for the object you're getting. And we can see both of those values get logged here. So Red and John, for Red being the index of 4 in the array, and John being the dot name for the object. And so one thing to talk about here that's kind of somewhat new in JavaScript is instead of defining variables through this var for their declarations or their assignments, there's been a new way of defining them or assigning them called let. And the significance of this is that when a variable is assigned with var, it's assigned at a global scope. And what that means is that it's that same value for the whole duration of the script. But using let, you can assign a variable within a specific block of code, and it does not propagate outside of that block of code. So we kind of have an example here to show that, right? So we assigned x to 1 at the top of our script here, and so we're printing out the initial value of x, which should be 1. And then we have a for loop. So you can see that, a for loop is relatively simple in JavaScript. It's just your as you expect with the for loop, it's var x equals 0, x is less than some value, and then x plus plus to do the iterations on it. And so we're using var here to assign our x value to initialize this for loop. And, we're just doing some random value additions here. Not really important for this. And we're going to print out the value of x after we've accomplished this for loop, right? So if you've done 5 iterations, you're doing less than 5. So you're going to assume that x at the end of this loop is going to be 5. But then we'll reset x to 1 here, which doesn't, we'll set var at a global scope again. And then in the second for loop, we'll use let instead. And what that means is that let is only inside of the scope of this for loop. And so x is going to be incremented again, but because it's only inside the scope of this block, it won't propagate to this final version, this final log statement here. So what we should expect is that x at the end is going to be 1 still, because that's the global scope of x. And x within this block was only changed to 5, but then it was brought back to the global scope because of the var outside of it. And so let's go back to our script here now that we've uncommented that and refresh it, and we'll see exactly what we were saying. So declaration started off as 1. After the first for loop, it came out to be 5. It was changed. But in the second for loop where we used let instead, it was preserved within that block. And so this is useful. Obviously in a for loop, it's especially useful just to make sure your for loops aren't overriding your values. But in a greater context, because you might have more complex scripts where you don't want to be changing the global scope of variables because of the own blocks of code that you might be adding into it. And so let is a very useful way of doing assignments for variables, and we'll see that in the A-frame portion of this tutorial in the scripting there for why it's important to make sure you're not changing global scoped variables within your own sections of code. And the last thing we'll talk about with JavaScript here is defining functions. So it's, again, relatively simple to define a function in JavaScript. It's just the syntax of function, the name of the function, what parameters are being passed into it, and then just something that happens inside the scope of this function. And so we'll just do a log statement here, but you could also do a return statement. You could just do return, whatever information you want. There's no, again, because of the way that typing works in JavaScript, there's no guarantee of the type that you're going to get back from a function. And a function based off of what it's doing could return different types at different times. So again, that's something to kind of be careful of with your functions to make sure that the parameters you're passing in and what you're expecting back are the types that you're expecting. But we just have an example here, passing in 2 numbers to this. The expectation should be that if we come to this function and refresh again, the result is 7. And an important thing to note here about numbers in JavaScript is that there's only one number type. There's no integers and doubles or floats. It's all just a number type. So you can do things like have decimals or no decimals. Everything is assumed to just be a number. So you can just add 3.1 to 4, and likewise what you'll expect is 7.1, right? All numbers are just numbers. There's no integer decimal separation there. So this has just been a high-level description of how JavaScript works. You'll see it a lot more later on in the tutorial, but now we're going to start talking about A-frame specifically in the next video.